Hello, everyone. This is Pastor Allen. I'm glad you joined me today. I pastor both the Garrison Church of God and the Riverdale Community Church. At Riverdale, our services are on Sunday morning at 8:30, and at Garrison, our services begin at 10:30. So we'd love to have you come and be a part of any of these services. I hope you're having a wonderful day. I want to continue with my series on Psalm 46. We're looking at verses 2 and 3, and I want to talk to you about when everything is moving. Surprisingly, this psalm is very evocative or paints a picture for us of geological events that would happen in an earthquake. You have the movement of the earth. You have the shearing off of mountains. You have the sea moving and shifting in a tsunami-like effect. You have everything roaring and changing. And I think that's somewhat what happens to us in crisis events. This psalm really reflects what a crisis event is like. A crisis is that time when something happens, when after it nothing will be the same in life. There are lots of events like that in our lives. There are lots of moments like that. And sometimes we experience years like the one we're having right now, where events overwhelm us and overshadow us. One of the neat things about this particular psalm is it talks to us about the fact that God is our refuge in the midst of such circumstances. In verse 2, the writers of that psalm, the sons of Korah, tell us that we will not fear even though the earth be in continual movement. I like that picture, the idea of an earthquake shattering and shaking everything around us. In this process of life, there are a lot of things that move us and transform us and change us. Fear is one of the really dangerous things that happens in the midst of these circumstances. We begin to be afraid and we allow it to dominate and control us. The sons of Korah talk about this in relationship to our lives. They talk about how fear begins to dominate or control. The tense of the verb that is used here in Hebrews is a type of passive reflexive type use, which means that the person is allowing fear of their own volition to control them. In other words, we are cooperating with the fear in our lives, and that becomes dangerous. We, in moments of danger, always feel fear. But that fear, when we allow it to dominate our decision-making processes, turns into something we call panic. Panic is a destructive force in our lives. When they were talking about the thing that would be the most fearful in life, they used the image of an earthquake and the circumstances surrounding it. I can imagine nothing more terrifying than to be caught in an earthquake of a magnitude above 7 on the Richter scale. That would be a terrifying event. And then to have something like a tsunami to deal with that, or to have to deal with the explosion of a volcano. In 1960, in Chile, such an event took place. Literally, the worst earthquake that has ever been recorded in modern history happened. It was above 9.5 on the Richter scale. It was devastating. The only good thing is that it took place in a fairly sparsely populated area of the world. As a result of that, the death toll was far smaller than it might have been expected. In Chile alone, the death rate from this earthquake and the aftershocks and events that took place during it was a little over 5,000. In other parts of the world, there were also deaths. For a tsunami was generated by this earthquake that swept across the Pacific and hit even the shores of China. This fast-moving wave killed 61 people in Hilo, Hawaii. It killed several people in Japan. It did tremendous damage in what would be now calculated in the billions of dollars of damage around the Pacific Rim due to the tsunami effect. Literally, on the coastal range of mountains in Chile, mountains were sheared off into the sea. On their eastern side, they sheared off into the valleys, damming rivers and causing severe flooding. People were terrified. It must have felt like the end of the world for those 10 minutes when the earth shook out of control. These people were fearful. Some ugly things happened during these earthquakes and have happened throughout history during earthquakes and their aftermath. There was looting, pillaging, violence. There was also some pretty ugly things in this earthquake. An isolated native tribe in the mountains of Chile decided they needed to placate the angry earth. And so they took the grandchild of one of their elders, who was 5 years old, and sacrificed him to the earth. It was a terrible event. It is not unlike what happened in ancient times among our own ancestors when they faced such terrifying events. It is frightening to realize what we, in the midst of panic, are capable of. It is also astounding the heights to which we can rise in the midst of such circumstances. Because in the midst of that earthquake, there were people that rushed into the danger. They rushed in to help, to rescue, to rebuild, to hazard themselves in the hopes of helping someone. In that process, they mastered their fear and allowed it to be swept away in their belief that there were things that were more important in life. I would hope that I would fall into that category if I face those types of circumstances. The writer of this psalm understands that fear is the opposite of faith. It takes us away from the refuge of God when we begin to panic. Instead, the writers tell us that we need to seek the refuge of God. The sons of Korah probably remembered Numbers chapter 16, where their ancestor Korah had led a rebellion against Moses, and literally the earth had opened up and swallowed him and the rest of those leading the rebellion, where fire had fallen from heaven and wiped out 250 Levites who had joined the rebellion. And yet, in Numbers chapter 26, verse 11, it tells us that the sons of Korah did not join him in this rebellion. And they continued. They were given charge of the gates of the tabernacle, and later they would be given charge of the gates of the temple. One of Korah's ancestors, Samuel, the prophet, would become one of the great leaders in Israel, and his grandson would be selected by David to lead the worship of the temple, to collect the worship music, and probably he was responsible for beginning the collection that would become the book of Psalms. His descendants would go on to lead and direct the worship in the temple. It was a moment of transition where crisis led to courage. The disciples of Jesus would be faced with this reality in their own lives. Jesus, having had a long day of ministry, had fallen asleep on the ballast bags under the bow decking on their boat. Suddenly a microburst comes up, and the wind and the waves begin to shake the boat. It begins to pitch and turn. Water is coming over the gunwales, and they are terrified as the wind and the waves sweep over them. They wake Jesus with an accusation. "Master, do you not care that we are perishing?" When they translated one of the words that talked about the movement of things, the earth moving, it says, or being removed, as it's translated often, literally that word means to move from place to place in the Hebrew. But when they translated it into Greek in the centuries before Christ's birth, they used the Greek word for trouble. That's a fascinating word. It is repeated in the gospel accounts to talk about the disciples. Not when they are terrified, but later. Because Jesus awakes, stands up, looks at the wind and the waves, and says simply, "Be still." And it says immediately everything was calm. The disciples, it said, at that moment were troubled because they did not understand what kind of man this was that had the power to command the wind and the waves. It is amazing to us what God can do in our lives when fear is quieted. But when we give way to fear, it creates trouble in our souls. It creates a lack of faith. These disciples, Jesus would go on to say to them, "You of little faith, don't you know God has this under control?" That's what it means for God to be our refuge. When we give way to panic and fear in our lives, it is the opposite of faith. And God does not want that in our lives. As we face this crisis that is coming at us in this year, it is important that we not give way to panic and fear, but instead, if necessary, we run to the danger, because God has called us to be His disciples, to be men and women of faith, and not to be controlled by fear. You have a wonderful day. God bless you.